What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you another video in the vein of the cavalcade of games that have been released unexpectedly or with announcements that have thrown my work schedule off, though luckily in my line of work that's usually a good thing. This time, however, we are talking about Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon, which just very recently got an official release date, alongside the pretty exciting announcement of third-person mode, which they had up until this point essentially claimed was not happening, alongside a host of other details. So, straight away, probably the most exciting bits of all of that, realistically, is the release date, which just so happens to be May 23rd, less than a month away, and just in time for my own birthday on the 30th, as it happens. Now, I've been following Tainted Grail essentially since it launched into early access about 2 years ago, give or take, but I'd actually talked about it relatively recently, right at the end of March, when they released what was meant to be their final early access patch, the 0.9 patch. And if you watched that video at all, while I was always going to cover this game, that one in particular got me actually excited for the release version because it was a significant step up in terms of presentation and just overall systems and mechanics. Now, that said, there were some significant bugs in that patch, and I'll get to that in a moment, as I do want to touch on that a little later in this video. But content and gameplay-wise, I'm very much so looking forward to this one, as its blending of dark Arthurian myth and legend, alongside more tried-and-true RPG systems I tend to be a pretty big fan of, and how it clearly takes some cues from the Elder Scrolls series as an example, probably highlighted a bit more than usual by the recent shadow drop of Oblivion Remastered, which is obviously a game that I love very much. So plenty of reasons for me to be excited. But what I had pretty much come to terms with is that there would be no third person in this particular game, which honestly is kind of whatever to me. I get why people want one or the other, that kind of thing, but it's just not something that has ever made a huge dent in my own enjoyment of a title. I'm usually good either way. But discounting myself, I do know that it is an important feature for a lot of people who would otherwise not enjoy purely first-person gameplay, not least of which because they recently revamped the character creation as part of the 0.9 patch, and I imagine at least some people would like to see the character they are making outside of just menus. Which is why I think a feature like this is generally pretty well received. With that in mind, though, they were pretty clear in this update that the intention of the third person is that it is simply to give an option to people who couldn't play otherwise. They refer to it as an accessibility feature even. Now, I will say with that, everything I've seen of the third person view so far seems perfectly fine, but they did seem to want to stress that it wouldn't be quite up to par with first person because the game was developed as a first person title first and foremost. So we'll have to see how it is in the full release, so to speak, but for now, seems promising enough. With that in mind, if you would like to see more of this, it looks like Wolfheart FPS, another channel that covers a lot of very similar games to this one, has a lot of gameplay footage of that mode specifically, if you'd like to go check it out over there, as he's been covering the game as part of a sponsored thing where he's been showing off developer / test build stuff, so do keep that in mind. But that video should give you a pretty good idea of what third person is all about in this game. But alongside those big things, we did get some other information as well. For starters, they showed off their deluxe edition, which I just wanted to mention because, as a joke, they added horse armor to it in addition to their soundtrack and art book and all that. But the timing there was very funny because it was intended to be a slight joke about Oblivion, which then suddenly got shadow dropped, and while you might think those two things were related, this was announced like maybe 2 or 3 days after the Oblivion Remaster shadow dropped, and I just don't see that being enough time to have fully developed, implemented before hitting marketing in a couple days span, so I'm inclined to believe them, but it was pretty funny. They did actually want to go out of their way to mention that the horse armor is in fact purely cosmetic, and that if anything, the cooler mounts and armors in the game will be something you have to earn, and they even showed off pictures of this kelpie horse thing that looks especially bizarre and interesting. Outside of that little tidbit though, they also talked a bit about some of the upcoming content with 1.0 naturally. Starting first and foremost with the main story. Now, if you've played the current early access patch, you are probably aware to some degree that choice and consequence plays a role there, and they talk about how there will be obviously a branching narrative involved in that will lead to multiple different endings. I don't want to spoil anything, but again, if you've played the current bit of early access, it seems well telegraphed enough where that's probably going to go. So I'll be curious to see if they throw any surprises in there. But either way, they're anticipating it taking between about 50 to 70 hours to complete the game, though I'm unsure if they just mean the main story or the entire thing there, as we'll be encountering something something like 200 or so side quests across the game's 3 full zones, 2 of which we've already seen featured in early access, though I believe only one of them is available right this second. And it's likely you'll be experiencing those side quests to get your hands on all the new items, equipment, and everything else that's going to come into play in those later acts as well, because as it stands, the Act 1 of the game, which is what is in early access presently, is pretty much the same as what you can expect on launch, which is why in patch 0.9 there, we see the bulk of the systems already at play. And if you want to check some of those out for yourself, actually, there is a free demo you can download on Steam right now to play it. And it's probably worth a mention that the game's current price of $45 US is not planned to increase for launch either, because they already did that with patch 0.9. It was a little cheaper, like $30, and then they announced that rise up to full price for what they planned on the launch version, which was $45. But I wanted to end this video talking about something I would consider relatively important, and that is, of course, bugs and the general state of things when the game releases, because I don't think it's too much of a surprise that games that don't test things in early access periods like this tend to have more struggles with them. In fact, that was one of the things I was saying about Baldur's Gate 3 before it launched, because Larian has done that previously as well. That is to say, they do a really good and thorough early access of the early game, only for the launch version to have a really buggy end game because it didn't receive the same quality of testing, which panned out to be true for both Divinity Original Sin 2 and Baldur's Gate 3. And I tell you that simply to mention that that is essentially what I'm expecting to happen here. They have very much so tested that first act. I expect it will probably be quite good. They've even tested previously some of the Act 2 area, which from personal experience was also pretty enjoyable. In fact, they even had a quest with like a wizard guy T-posing, but the joke is that he's actually frozen that way, so they took something that was supposed to look like a bug but just turned it into an actual quest, which I thought was funny. But what we have not seen actually tested is the third act, and as these things tend to go, I'm expecting that to be buggy, not least of which because the current early access bit is frankly a bit buggy, and they have released some patches since that launch to smooth some things out, but those problems are there, and while that's kind of the nature of early access, to be honest, when it comes to a 1.0 release, that gets to be a bit different. And many people, myself included, become less forgiving about performance problems. So while I am very much so looking forward to this game, to be very blunt with you, I'm expecting it to be good but buggy, especially the parts of it that have not been tested in early access. So I'm hoping for the best there, but just going from what I've seen, that seems to be a pretty likely scenario. Though with any luck, I'll be able to review this one ahead of time and let you guys know what I think about it one way or the other. But for today, I think that's pretty well gonna do it. So I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.